Thank you, Michele. And it's obviously a pleasure to be physically present here again at the MTF. And sorry I couldn't join you last year because of the lockdowns, but it's definitely a community that I feel very closely connected to. I am a practicing artist, but my background is quite mixed. I come from an architecture study, classical music, as well, because I became fascinated by Goethe's idea that architecture was crystallized music, so I actually had to study both. I also became fascinated by the way that scientists throughout the ages, in different forms, would tell the story of how our universe works and what methods they apply to it. At the same time, I also became interested in how we, with our bodies, with our mindsets, interpret those data, how we interpret those signals from the universe, and how we make sense of them. So I became very interested in actually studying more with psychologists. But ultimately, it came all down to a very personal perspective of how do I, as a person, as a human being, here and now, make sense of all that, and how do I express my relationship to the tiny, the micro, the macro, and just to the everyday. I have several fascinations that probably link me to, as you've probably noticed throughout our conversations this afternoon and yesterday. I have been very fascinated by morphogenetics. This is probably the architectural side of me. I wasn't actually happy with putting together just bricks and mortar and using piano and plaster and paint. I wanted to see whether you could transform this material and kind of put it into different shapes and make sounds with light and sort of sense your touch, sort of all the synesthetic aspects of that. And I started really digging more into that and became very interested in the issues of topology. So topology was this principle derived from mathematics, obviously, that explains that the form can be generated not just by adding and subtracting or cutting and pasting, but especially by twisting, stretching, pulling, contorting. And this already began to sound a bit like water. So water became a big fascination just in terms of morphology, but also in terms of expression, in terms of the source of life and everything that it inspires, the relationship that we have with the world. So I got on a journey towards creating what I mostly do these days, which is a kind of an immersive opera format. It's on a smaller scale, but I tend to use a lot of multimedia, and I didn't really always work like that. I started also with very analog ways, so I'm also a performer, I'm a physical performer, I'm a kind of a mover, dancer, but I tend to activate the rest of the, say, the sonography or the elements by using my movement or using my voice. I also had obviously the divine coincidence of, they say you choose your parents, right? So my mom is a psychologist and pianist, and my dad is, well, he started as an artist, but he became a specialist in fluid dynamics and black holes, and it completely informed my upbringing, and just being confronted with these big questions and not being so focused on what we know, how we produce knowledge, and what barriers we have to understanding the world we see around us. And just always asking yourself, well, how does it actually work, and how do you relate to that? So I became fascinated by learning about water and how water as a substance is this ultimately intelligent fluid that is basically our largest component part of our bodies, that is also the element that, as already Thales of Milet says, all things are made out of water. We are carrying this memory in our bodies, probably that we have belonged to this vast ocean. And I became very fascinated with the phenomena surrounding turbulence, vorticity, and all the phenomena of water at extreme conditions, such as high pressure, speed, but also just regular phenomena that we encounter in everyday life. This led me to then start experimenting with VR and visualizing these phenomena, trying to visualize speed of light, singing the speed of elements, singing like water, using quarter tone singing, just testing different methodologies, again, on a topological basis that would help me construct these new structures that actually felt more organic, that didn't feel like they were built, they were man-made, but they felt very intuitively, sort of from the inside out. This was a multimedia performance that was actually a tiny opera inspired by speed of light and diodicity and some of Tesla's ideas of fusion. So I very often tend to take ideas from science and see how I can integrate them into this multimedia aspect of performing, creating, singing, visualizing, and how I can also perhaps use this as a platform for bringing those abstract ideas closer to an audience. And we've been talking about this earlier this afternoon, about this similarity or transscalarity when it comes to the deep sea on one hand and maybe the deep space on the other, this being the two extremes of the scale, and the human being kind of being in the center of perceiving these two extremities of the world. I also had a very interesting experience when I was growing up in Slovenia. Obviously, there was the new Neue Slowenische Kunst happening, the movement that also expressed their ideas in one of their incarnations was called the Cosmokinetic Theatre. This was a group that performed, I believe, one of the first experiences, ballet performance in Gravity Zero, and it absolutely blew my mind that you could, do a project without clear limits about what is possible, and that you would always push that edge of how far you can bring your expression, how far you can bring this art and science synergy. So it was a big learning curve. This was also a point where it became clear that a lot of the astronauts actually trained in conditions underwater. They train in high pressure systems, and that these kind of synergies exist between what is out there and actually what is below. And I believe that this became a fascination for me as well. The problem of the turbulence, chaos, the vorticity was part of my obsession in the development of some of the more installation-based and sculptural work, and I became very focused on the Mobius strip, and then also studying the geometry of it and how to double it, how to make kind of two loops seemingly meet in infinity space. So this became a sort of a metaphor for life and constant recycling and regeneration, but it also gave birth to a lot of projects and speculative projects and AR pieces that were trying to match the inner workings, the inner mechanisms of nature, the inner pulsations that ultimate, almost like black hole types of behaviors, to an environmental art, to media art, and to geometry. Just going to run through a couple of examples of that. In my earlier years, I worked as an architect, but then again, I became very fascinated about how you could generate forms in a different way, how you could actually use animation and simulation of particle fields to actually generate structures. And it was this kind of twisting, growing principles, the fluidity of form, the time-based form that really inspired me, because I thought, well, we do live in a very dynamic world, and change is the only constant. So how come that we try to create, to encapsulate our lives in spaces that are actually very rigid, very solid, very abstract, that we can't really connect to. Very, very quickly, I also came across, through some collaborations with particle physicists, to the idea that you could trigger some deformation of these structures by introducing pulsations of music, so acoustic parameters. And I think that at this point, everything was just absolutely clear and lit up for me, and I was like, oh yeah, that's the frozen music we were talking about. Now we can start the dance. So I became also interested in how the structures that we build and that we make and that we visualize and metaphorically present as structures, as thought models, how we can also embody them. So as a performer, I was trying to perform my architecture in that way, with this twisting, ongoing, continuous movements, a lot of meditative practice, such as Buto-based practice of dance and movement, that were trying to really embody this kind of fluidity of movement, the fluidity of motion, the constant change and transformation without any rough edges, without any sort of discreteness encapsulated with that. Another aspect I was very interested in was light, and how light can get triggered by sound, and how we can create reactive spaces based on either video signal or a change in acoustic parameters, and how that can be connected to an output in a different modality, such as a change of form, and how we can paint with sound, how we can sculpt with sound. So in a way, these synesthetic connections were something that I was always very drawn to. And I believe that most artists are, to one degree or another, synesthetic. And I also think that it's not natural for human beings to start practicing very deeply isolated, singular modalities of knowledge or expression. I believe that it's much more intuitive and natural to connect them, to connect across disciplines, to connect across media, because we are creatures that actually perceive with a variety of senses and also need to express ourselves as such. I tried to see if I could connect the audio to light and color, and make this kind of dancing landscapes following the part of the music. working a lot with pause as being the essential part of the musical landscape, working with breath, working with the rhythmicity that breath is giving to our lives and our structure. And another big obsession was study the particle fields and how the different triggers actually create the deformation of a field and how we can parametrically model that. And I have to say that this has then developed, especially in the field of architecture, into a very well-known practice. A lot of architects started working that way. So there's been a big, I would say, almost revolution in the way we saw build form. It became very dynamic, it became fluid, it almost started behaving like water, and we just froze it at one particular moment. This is more like in Bergson's ways that we look at the frozen moment. And this started opening a whole new platform of possibilities. You know, what happens if I could treat build form or static form as if it were fluid, if I could just completely manipulate it at a different time scale? And of course, the early visualization, animation processes allowed this kind of new fluidity to find its form, and also to make people aware of the possibility that these new states that were perhaps invisible to us were offering as a point of departure. And I started also working a lot with the way that the numbers actually do the dance. The numbers actually can provide you a sustainable composition. One of my first jobs was teaching architectural composition, so it's all about number theory and proportions. But it's quite fascinating how, beside thinking just about historic architecture or historic works, how that can relate to a dynamic form, and how, if you apply a certain logic in numbers, how that can initiate a structure, a form, a movement that feels incredibly natural. So it's almost like trying to translate the inner logics of our organic world to something that is man-made. This piece was based on a Fibonacci series, and it's great because it can just run for hours and you kind of not get bored of the rhythm. Anyway, I'm not going to be that long. So just a few examples of particle visualizations and how we can interact and activate those fields. I try to implement these ideas, these observations about particle movement, also to installations, light and color installations. Particularly one piece I did kind of a musical stairs with a lot of ASMR effects and sort of Fibonacci-based choice of color palettes and kind of a matrix that was the basis of the sound composition, was also following the Adams extended Fibonacci pattern table. So this was the actual notation, just introducing the numbers that presented the duration of particular tones, and then the pauses were actually these spaces in between them. I'm sometimes working on these ambiental pieces where I try to bring in some elements from nature, especially in the world that is full of concrete and man-made structures, just to soften it up, to kind of try to allow, especially the public that uses these spaces, to have this relation to the nature that maybe has been edited out, that has been forgotten, and just to be childlike, to see the response to their action, to maybe see the consequence of their movement, their emotions, maybe see the changes throughout the seasons, throughout every hour of a day. This was a piece that actually has a 365 days, 24 hours a day script. So it's very complex and always evolving. As a classically trained performer, I also was trying to introduce the element of the body and trying to figure out how to get the sense of this embodiment and the connection of the structures that we are sort of building intellectually, analyzing intellectually, creating out there as a anthropomorphic, but also specifically man-made, as like inserting our will to the organic world and thus transforming it. But how can we also transform ourselves? And I began also a series of performances where I explored different alchemical principles about dissolving myself and so on. And this was also the continuation that brought me to use more and more of virtual reality, augmented reality, and performances that were trying to get away from the body, the idea that we have, get away from the structure as we know it, and sort of to blend the limits between the inner and the outer world, to extend the limits of our body, to apply, let's say in this particular case, a song to generate a crystallized form, which is very close to cymatics, which is what I'm hoping to invite you to experiment with this week. And in a way, this inner impulse, the inner voice, the inner movement, the rhythmicity of that, the somatic movement, became an important impulse in generation of my works, and became almost like the body-centric, human-centric element in the creation of pieces that I sometimes felt would lack a human connection, a human dimension. I also became interested in the way that we can use our bodies to direct all content. So in terms of gesture interfacing and just creating a sense of magic. I always remember the anecdotes that I was told about especially prehistoric buildings such as temples that were designed to highlight astronomic phenomena, and if you're the master of ceremony, the shaman or the priest, you would obviously be able to delight and surprise and put the fear of God in people's heads by just bringing them together at the right time and show them, let's say, a solar eclipse. But today I think that science and nature still gives us that fascination, but at the same time the technology also gives a sense of magic. And it may not only be something cold and distant and remote, it can also allow us to enhance the more sensual, intuitive, subconscious parts. I became very interested again in these other ways of how to synesthetically work with myself as the initiator of interaction. So for example, I choreographed my voice through gesture interfacing. This was done with a Kinect setup and a Max. So it was almost like feeling the whole space as being this sentient fluid that I could play like an instrument. had a really interesting collaboration, especially with my colleagues at Goldsmiths, looking into new ways of sensing the body, recognizing body in motion through use of camera vision, and sort of being able to really provide that sense of magic on stage, where the performer can seemingly transform content just by movement or voice activation. And that gave birth to a series of performances. And there are several levels of how we integrate our presence in an immersive environment. For example, this was a piece we did a while ago for what was supposed to be the first real-time gallery, and this was a real-time piece. So it was kind of a synesthetic environment full of trigger points that triggered actually sound loops, and the sound loops would trigger the 3D light animations. So in a way, every observer, every user of that space could create their own unique experience, and there would be no ways to repeat the same experience twice. So basically your path would determine, even more like a game, it would determine your experience. So we had a lot of different reactions to that. Either people would just run through the space, or they would just pause on a certain scene and make it loop. And I started thinking about opening that up into a space of performance where I could actually play those virtual contents by using VR headsets, but using that on stage, and also projecting that to a structure that would work like a constantly evolving light piece that people could be also able to interact with and walk in and experience. So in a way, I'm very interested in using the tools such as virtual reality just to generate, to start, to initiate an experience, and not as the end point. I'm currently working on a piece that is researching the beauty of kinematics and water, the understanding of the particle world and how we relate to that. There was an interesting theory connecting the world of particles to the fluids. It was in the frame of wave string theory, and perhaps we can go to that a little bit later. But it's, again, an attempt to provide multiple platforms from the AR experiences, talking again about phenomena we encounter in water, talking about turbulence, talking about this vorticity and the power of vortex to actually cross the boundaries of what we know in terms of limits of the way our Newtonian universe works, and to kind of slip into almost a, I would say, Tesla-based understanding of the universe. I'm trying to also combine AR with live streaming, so this is more like just a technical side of that, and some more snapshots of that, which will basically just again tell you more about my fascination with somatics, patterns, turbulence, vortexes, structures, the breathing patterns, and the music, and how we, through our voice, through our presence, through our movement, can relate to those worlds. This is again just the screen grab from a virtual reality piece. So you would be actually floating in the space, just like tiny size. would very like to encourage you to also have lots of conversations with me about somatics, about water, about the importance of connecting the arts, science, and technology to make those next steps in terms of either conservation, but also finding new tools and new ways to provide solutions for the environment. I think the artists are perfect partners for that because of the mindset. So I wish you a very pleasant evening, and I hope to engage more with your conversations. So thank you very much.